and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio for the week of July 30th, 2016. Another week in the asylum passes. Many trying to go about their lives as if nothing's wrong. Won't be able to stay in that paradigm much longer. This show is broadcast again on KQMS throughout Northern California, Saturday morning, 6 to 7 a.m. It's a commercial-free news hour to try to get as much of the news across as possible, and that hour is not nearly enough, period. I want to begin with a 2,000-year-old quote from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, something to remember and consider as we go through such challenging times. Happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within our control, other things are not. It is only after you have faced up to this fundamental rule and learned to distinguish between what you can and can't control that inner tranquility and outer effectiveness become possible. Again, from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. The outer effectiveness part is what is so critical because so many people feel overwhelmed that they don't take a single step on the correct path, and that's a mistake. And as the ancient proverb also says, to have taken one step on the correct path is to have arrived. The journey is the destination. You must begin marching in the right direction. That's the bottom line. Far too much to cover again this week, but let's get to what we can. First, we're now less than a week away from the extremely important public awareness event that's going to be held in the Cascade Theater in Reading on August 5th, 2016. Color glossy two-sided informational flyers are available for free from Orchard Nutrition in Reading. Our government was not satisfied with the vast majority of the population being injected with vaccinations that are absolutely proven to contain inarguably harmful additives like thimerosal, aluminum, and other toxic elements. No, the vast majority was not enough. Now, in the state of California, this is the so-called freedom that we are now being forced to accept, that our children cannot go to school unless or until they have the toxic jabs that the state requires. And for those who completely run for cover when unpleasant truths are presented, truths that would separate them from the majority if they were to even take the time to investigate, stay tuned. I'll get to more detailed analysis of your condition, as presented in a report by top professionals in the field. I'm talking about the self-defense mechanism of rationalization, to go with all the other psychological self-defense mechanisms like Stockholm Syndrome and flat-out denial. All of these are epidemic in populations around the globe, but nowhere more so than in the U.S. And in regard to the vaccinations, how can anyone accept that they are safe when the stated ingredients in many vaccinations include known toxic elements that are added to the vaccinations? How can anyone state that they're safe when we now have statistical data right from a top scientist at the CDC who is stating on the record that he and others at the CDC systematically lied about the dangers? Here's a question. Why won't Congress allow this top scientist to testify and to reveal the thousands of documents he has from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, to prove his claims? How can any rational parent or any rational human being not be concerned when the incidence of neurological damage to our children, most especially autism, has statistically risen from 15,000% to 20,000%, somewhere in that range, depending on the studies, in the last 4 decades? Who would not be concerned about that? This is from a conservative estimate of 1 in 5,000 in 1975, autism rates again, to rates today that may now be as high as 1 in 25. And now we have, as I've stated before, MIT researchers telling us that on the current trajectory, in the next decade, every other child will have autism. And are we to think that the child is not diagnosed as healthy and at full potential? How could they be? How could they be? Now, what caring parent would not take the time and trouble to, at bare minimum, attend the Reading event, a free event, to see a groundbreaking documentary film, again, free of charge, and to be able to speak directly to frontline physicians in this battle that will be there to answer questions from the public? And again, I ask, what caring parent would not even take the time to consider the facts when the health and safety of their child is in the balance? And for all those that wish to remain firmly rooted in the programmed groupthink that secures their place in the herd, how can you look yourselves in the mirror if you don't, at minimum, take the time to investigate? And if you want to cling to the lie that, quote, they, the healthcare professionals, are always right and would never do this to us, consider the facts. The statistics of mortality that is directly related to incorrect and harmful medical procedures is beyond staggering. They, the professionals, put known neurotoxins of mercury in your mouth in the form of fillings. They, the healthcare professionals, recommend fluoridated water, and the agencies, governmental agencies, are all too happy to accommodate, aren't they? Fluoride that was used to help subdue prisoners in Nazi prisoners of war camps, known neurotoxins of fluoride put in our water by the quote-unquote experts. When do we start thinking for ourselves? When do we start seeing through the massive sea of lies that we're all swimming in? Official agencies are tasked with and perform an ongoing effort to hide an endless list of growing environmental contamination from the public in any and every way they can. More details on that later in this report. They pump unimaginably toxic fracking fluids in groundwater wells. They dump it in the ocean. They, again, which ultimately means those who print the money, because all roads lead back to those who print the money. They control the militaries, they control all the government agencies and everything else down the line. Those who print the money. That's the they at the top of the food chain. The global elite. And they are the ones who run, again, militaries and every agency down the line. Let's remember they've also detonated over 2,000 nuclear bombs just for practice, which has contaminated the entire planet. They, the central bankers, the money printers, and all those who cooperate with them, have now created 3 nuclear volcanoes in Japan. That is the Fukushima incident, with virtually no known technology to fix this triple meltdown and no end in sight. And this nightmare may kill us all if all other catastrophes don't get us first, if we stay on this course. And even with all this, 60 more nuclear power plants are being built, and many old and unsafe nuclear power plants are being put back online. So, for those who like to convince themselves with rationalization, which again I'll report on further later in this report, those who like to rationalize and convince themselves that the proverbial they, the top group of global elite power, the central bankers, would not do this to themselves, that's simply not a reality. I could go on and on and on about what they have done to themselves, depleted uranium, lots and lots of issues. Back to the original point of all this. If you accept that vaccinations are safe because the power structure says so, you need to do a major reality check. We're talking about the health of our children. Be responsible, show up, and find out what you did not want to know, but what you have a responsibility to find out. Am I against all of mainstream medicine? Absolutely not. There are many caring and concerned professionals, and I recognize this fact. But good intentions only go so far, and I've already experienced a number of the instant herd mentality hostile behavioral responses from some of our local North State, quote, medical professionals that clearly did not want anything to do with investigating the CDC whistleblower facts presented. This is especially true if one tries to pass on this information to a group of medical co-workers that are all standing together, and they seem in such circumstances to want to be sure that their peers know that they are sticking to the herd narrative, that they would not betray the herd program narrative, and I would ask, how can any medical professional take their oath of do no harm and then not even bother to investigate the groundbreaking information provided by this CDC top scientist whistleblower? This is a direct contradiction. If you're a medical professional and you're listening to this broadcast, and if you have a conscience, and if you take your oath of do no harm seriously, then you have an absolute obligation to investigate. Again, I know this firsthand, the program response, because I have been distributing flyers to some medical facilities in the North State myself. And it's truly astounding. This instant, knee-jerk, programmed denial. Yes, I know all about that. I'm not going to look because I already know. Because I'm following the marching orders given to me. This is the mentality of many in fact, unfortunately, in the medical industrial complex, that they want to make sure you know that they will stick to the programmed pharmaceutical industrial complex narrative, and they don't want to know the truth, and that's simply inexcusable. So again, I hope any medical professionals listening will take the time to show up at this Reading event and find out what you don't know, what you have not been told, and the lies that you are adhering to, that vaccinations are safe. I'll end my diatribe there. Show up if you care. For those that want to hear just how off the rails our government is in regard to the silencing of whistleblowers, again, come to the Cascade Theater and hear the truth right from the source, from former decorated CIA officer Kevin Shipp, who will be presenting his story at the Cascade event on the morning of August 6th, the day after the Cascade event. 1 week from today, I'll be interviewing Kevin Shipp live on my morning edition of this show in the KQMS studio. Attorney Pete Peters will also interview Kevin for an even more detailed account of his story during the first hour of his show on Freedom in Action, which immediately follows mine. So Mr. Shipp will be on air from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. on the morning of August 6th, former CIA officer Kevin Shipp, to discuss what our government is doing to whistleblowers, anyone who dares to tell the truth. But why not come to meet Kevin in person at the Cascade and sign up for a copy of his shocking book, From the Company of Shadows? And a final note to anyone that gets the Northern California Record Searchlight newspaper on Tuesday, August 2nd, there should be a two-sided, full-color, glossy flyer for the major public awareness event in Reading on the 5th at the Cascade Theater. Should be a copy of this flyer in each and every newspaper. If you get a copy of the Record Searchlight newspaper on Tuesday and you don't find a flyer in it, I'd like to hear about it. You can reach me at GeoEngineeringWatch.org. And let's hope that the Record Searchlight actually covers the news this time. As I've announced in the past, Searchlight editor Silas Lyons has stated to me in an email, that I read on air by the way, that he feels he has the right to decide what news people see and what they don't see, at least in the case of his newspaper. Something to keep in mind. So again, if you find a copy of the Record Searchlight on Tuesday, August 2nd that does not have a copy of our event flyer in it, please let me know. Now, how long can massive and unimaginably destructive climate engineering programs continue? How long can the unimaginably complex chain of coordination and resource supplies be maintained in regard to not just climate engineering, but modern industrialized society as a whole? Many people don't stop to consider this. It's an unimaginably complex and energy-intensive resource chain that keeps this balance going. And as this balance is attempted to be maintained, this modern industrialized, militarized, pharmaceutical industrial society, the energy balance of our planet is being horribly derailed. And many people don't understand, mathematically speaking, our planet is on the edge of the habitable zone in our solar system. And once that energy balance is lost, and it has been lost, we are spiraling towards a planet that will not sustain life. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's happening at blinding speed, absolutely blinding speed. It doesn't unfold in centuries or decades. The course we are on right now, if it's maintained, leads to a planet that will not support life in an unimaginably short amount of time. It's happening by the day right now, literally. If you look at species extinction rates, which I cover often, if you look at the die-off occurring everywhere around us, oceans, forests, everything is dying off. I'll get to some more headlines on that in a moment. But how long can this current course be maintained? Not long. Now, in the effort to expose the single greatest assault on the environment and the climate system of all, climate engineering, legal efforts to expose and halt this insanity and to reach a critical mass of awareness, legal efforts have taken another step forward. And this is important to remember with the legal efforts. This battle is about waking the masses to climate engineering. None should make the mistake of sitting the bench thinking that they're not needed in this battle because others are trying to move the ball forward. All of us are needed, not just in the battle to stop climate engineering, but in the battle to expose vaccination dangers, the decimation to the environment, and the current course of certain suicide for the human race that we are all on at this moment. That's an absolute mathematically undeniable fact. So, the bottom line with these issues, reaching a critical mass, is the bottom line. And that's the primary basis of the legal action that's taking place, to wake the populations up. Here's a press release that was sent out last week to media sources all over the country. This is a short version, and I recommend all would read the entire legal document that was filed last week, a 60-day notice of legal filing. But this is the press release that went out all over the country. Anti-geoengineering legal team serves 60-day notice of intent to file federal actions against over 30 U.S. government and California state agencies and entities. This report was prepared by the Legal Alliance to Stop Geoengineering lead attorney James Grant, a Stanford graduate. The press release report states as follows. The U.S. government, including the Secretary of Defense Ashton B. Carter, U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff General Mark A. Welsh III, and Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Gina McCarthy, is being served a 60-day notice that the Legal Alliance to Stop Geoengineering, LASG, who currently represents over 30 proposed plaintiffs, will file one or more federal civil suits to seek declaratory and injunctive release pursuant to the Federal Clean Water Act and the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act to stop the toxic aerosol discharge programs that are occurring in the skies over California and beyond. The report continues. Notice is also being served on over 20 California state agencies, including the California Attorney General Kamala D. Harris and the Board of Supervisors for Shasta County. The programs at issue are sometimes referred to as solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, and or stratospheric aerosol injection programs, and are being conducted by various entities, including the U.S. military, its contractors, and affiliates, without regulatory agency scrutiny or public debate. Final excerpts from this report. These programs are releasing nanoparticulates of toxic materials, aluminum oxide, barium, and strontium, into the atmosphere. These discharges are occurring without legal permits, scientific justification, or public comment or debate. Specific violations contained in the 60-day notice include the unlawful aerial spraying and discharge of a variety of pollutants to waters of the United States without federal and state permits. Other violations stated in the 60-day notice include the failure of the California State and Regional Water Resource Control Boards to maintain the quality of drinking water sources, as well as U.S. EPA turning a blind eye on the programs and failing to monitor and protect water quality and enforce drinking water standards. Final statement on the report about us. The Legal Alliance to Stop Geoengineering, in coordination with GeoEngineeringWatch.org, is a Canadian-American alliance of like-minded attorneys and experts who are committed to exposing and halting global geoengineering programs. This press release went out to hundreds all over the country. Now, certainly we can already safely say that our local media, KRCR, and the Record Searchlight won't cover this, and we'll see if they cover the major event this year, which they completely omitted last year. Now, one key individual that Geoengineering Watch was contacted by immediately after this press release, which happened this previous week, was the National Academy of Sciences president, Marcia McNutt. Now, again, certainly our local media would never follow up on this because they're doing everything they can to hide it, but the president of the National Academy of Sciences bothered to contact us. What a contradiction that is, isn't it? Our local media doing what they do best, hide the truth. For an individual so far up in the power structure hierarchy to bother communicating with us is an indication of the progress that's already been made in bringing this issue to the light of day. The National Academy of Sciences president initially attempted to deny and marginalize the geoengineering issue and was countered in ensuing communication that I had with her. And an astounding change of tone came about with Marcia McNutt, again, the president of the National Academy of Sciences. I will post this email communication exchange next week with a direct mail contact for this National Academy of Sciences president, so that all can express their justifiable angst directly to Ms. McNutt. And this is important to remember when rattling the cages of any agency or elected official who is denying the geoengineering reality. Communicate in a professional and articulate fashion and send credible data links and CC other upstanding and concerned citizens with those communications, so that who you're communicating with, in this case perhaps Marcia McNutt or other officials, so that they know others are also witnessing this dialogue. It's about accountability. That's important. Just lashing out in an unprofessional and unfactual manner is not the correct tack to take. Now, this in no way means that a very straightforward statement can't be sent, such as reminding such power structure paid deniers that the population is indeed waking up to the climate engineering issue and will soon enough likely hold them legally and morally accountable for their part in hiding the climate engineering crimes. You can be direct, but do it in a professional, articulate manner. The bottom line, polish your message, keep it professional. Now, how about the global climate? What's happened in the last week that we're not told about by the U.S. mainstream media weapon of mass distraction? Did anyone hear that there was a heat index in the U.S. of 140 degrees in the last week? No, you didn't hear about that. How about the heat index readings that have occurred in other places around the globe this last spring that have in some occasions hit over 160 degrees? Now, this is even in April. India had a heat index of 165 degrees. For those that don't know what a heat index is, it's the feels like temperature. A combination of temperature and humidity that is historically, prior to previous years, never been recorded before, because the planet is now superheating. Those who deny this are simply not looking at the facts and not looking at reality. Climate engineering is making the situation far worse overall, not better. But it's no surprise that you didn't hear any of this from our mainstream media sources, because that's the role of mainstream media, which again includes Northern California's KRCR and the Record Searchlight. And this heat index reading occurred on July 24th on the border of Missouri and Arkansas. You'd think some of the U.S. population might be alarmed if they heard there was a heat index of 140, wouldn't you? But mainstream sources, and again this includes Weather Channel and other sources, they know how long their leash is, and they know better than to put out that kind of data. They know better, because those who control the purse strings, back to the central bankers, would deliver repercussions on them if they dared tell that kind of a truth. Now, the media has to acknowledge the record heat to some degree, because it's now impossible to hide. But the climate engineering, or as most media science sources are relabeling, has turned it climate intervention, is not addressed. Climate intervention, what a term is that? How would people feel about climate intervention? And that's a more accurate term than engineering, because engineering is a far too dignified term for what they're doing in our skies, which should be more correctly labeled climate destruction. Interfering with the planet's life support systems that allow us to live on this ball of rock in a hostile environment at the very edge of the Goldilocks zone. That's the scientific term for the habitable zone in an orbit around a star. And we are on the very edge of being too hot already. And now the energy balance of the planet has been completely disrupted, and intentionally disrupted now with climate engineering. And for those who try to convince themselves, and I hear this from some people who are very convinced that the military-industrial complex is all about our own good, which couldn't be further from the truth. And they try to convince themselves, they try to rationalize, and I'll get to more details on rationalization in a few moments, but they try to rationalize that The military-industrial complex wouldn't do this if it wasn't for our own good. Time to wake up. None of this is for our own good. It's about power and control, and even attempting to hide the severity of climate disintegration with programs that make that disintegration worse still is about power and control, not about benevolence, not about the common good. Now, some headlines on the climate this week. Let's go over a few quickly, and I want to get to some other parts of this report. How many heard about the catastrophic flooding in China that's killed hundreds and displaced millions? I believe 40 to 50,000 homes were destroyed. Did we hear about that? Isn't it perplexing that we have either drought or deluge all over the planet, and why would we expect otherwise? When we have countless forms of human activity, anthropogenic activity, disrupting the Earth's energy balance, and at the top of that list of disrupting factors, we have climate engineering. Not as an only factor, as many people, again, try to convince themselves of, that there's nothing wrong with the planet, and the human race hasn't heard anything except for climate engineering, and that's completely wrong. You couldn't even begin to quantify all the ways in which the human race has destroyed the natural balance of the planet. But climate engineering, again, at the top of that list, and climate engineering should be our foremost focus on exposing and stopping. So we have drought and deluge all over the globe, massive, unimaginable flooding in China. In fact, some regions had 1 year's worth of rain in one day. Does anyone think that's normal? We're talking about a 10,000-year flood. You can't even quantify this. When events like this happen, quote, official agencies make it up as they go. They make it up as they go. They come up with terms that this kind of flood happens only once in X amount of years. They have no idea, because we don't have the paleo data to confirm this type of event. So we're not being told about these events. California declares state of emergency over fires and heat. That's another headline. These are stories that, again, our mainstream media is not telling us. Here's another. Nearly 2.5 million birds dead as H5 avian influenza strain sweeps Baghdad, Iraq. Could anything else happen to Baghdad? What kind of carnage have we delivered to that city under the guise of freedom and democracy? That country's in ruins. So is Libya. So is Syria, with the terrorist groups that we're sponsoring there to topple the democratically elected government. So this is business as usual. Again, absolutely business as usual from Chile to, the list is endless, with governments that were not friendly to Western and U.S. interests that are brought down, quite simply brought down. And going all the way back to dots I've connected in many shows earlier, the grand chessboard, Brzezinski's plan for Western leaders to gain control of Eurasia, all of this is being played out right now. Let's get to some more headlines that we're not being told. Hurricane drought continues in the U.S. Isn't that astounding? With record warm oceans, record warm temperatures, month after month, shattering the previous month. The planet in total meltdown. Somehow we're pushing 11 years now with no major hurricane impacts in the U.S. How can that be? While the rest of the planet is being slaughtered with record hurricanes. Welcome to climate intervention. And as I said in last week's show, for those who think this is a good thing to stop these major hurricanes from happening, the planet's trying to cool itself. It's trying to cool itself. So what happens when you stop that process? The oceans die. They stratify. We get Canfield Ocean. This is a stratified, dead, lifeless, oxygenless ocean, and that's exactly where we're headed. It's not a good thing to interfere with Earth's natural processes. That's a recipe for certain suicide. Anthrax outbreak in Russia. That one's interesting, isn't it? Not much reporting on that going on in our local media. Another headline, terror attacks and mass killings are becoming a daily event. As the biosphere implodes, the economy will follow, power structures will become ever more desperate, and we will have many more of these types of attacks that are then immediately utilized by governments as a way to lock down society. And that's not an accident. Let's give an example of that right now. Turkey closes dozens of media sources. Part of the process. Isn't it interesting that there was a coup in Turkey and they already had a list before the coup even happened of who they were going to round up? Isn't that interesting? What kind of orchestration is going on there? And the first thing they do is to close media sources and round up anybody and everyone who doesn't agree with that government. And they're a NATO ally? The same NATO ally that was buying fuel from ISIS, the very terrorist groups that are supposedly behind many attacks that are happening all over the globe. This is not a coincidence. American population needs to wake up. They're the last potential counterbalancing force on the planet. And they seem bent on remaining in denial and rationalizing their denial until there's nothing left to salvage. Another headline: a blanket of smoke from fires in Siberia is so huge it can be seen from nearly 1 million miles away in space. This is not the sign of a planet that's cooling, as some still unimaginably want us to believe. Forests are burning down around the globe. Temperatures are soaring everywhere, and climate engineering is making it worse, not better, for a host of reasons. Again, and people can find this data. Go to geoengineeringwatch.org and start searching through some of the categories there and find out exactly why geoengineering, climate engineering, solar radiation management, climate intervention programs are so unimaginably, horrifically destructive and toxic. Another headline: tens of thousands of alpacas die in Peruvian cold snap. Now, this is one of the engineered events that makes people think the planet must be cooling when it's actually superheating, because the geoengineers can and are engineering chemically nucleated cooldowns to create headlines like the one I just read. Tens of thousands of alpacas die in Peruvian cold snap. By the way, 250,000 died last year, alpacas, in a, quote, cold snap, in spite of record warm temperatures in the surrounding regions and for the overall year. Somehow there's these freak cold snaps that slaughter everything on the ground, and it's happened in the U.S. here too. I want to remind everybody, October 4th, 2013, 100,000 cattle died in South Dakota with snow falling at 40 degrees. And with, at the same time, and I captured the weather maps, you can find them at geoengineeringwatch.org under engineered snowstorms. I captured and recorded those weather maps that showed at the same time these cattle died in South Dakota, it was 89 degrees and raining in Kansas City, it was 85 degrees and raining in Chicago, and the snowstorm was happening at 40 degrees on October 4th. How in the world could 100,000 cold-hardy cattle die in such a snowstorm? Because they're being exposed to chemically nucleated material which causes an endothermic reaction. Flash freeze burns their hide. It sticks like glue. This is a non-natural nucleated material. It clogs their nostrils so they can't breathe. If a cow can't breathe through its nose, it dies. When will people wake up? But they see a headline like this and they ignore all realities, clamp onto the headline, and use it to rationalize their denial of what's happening on the planet. From this report, the government of Peru declared a state of emergency in the southern Andes after brutally low temperatures killed tens of thousands of alpacas, according to the Associated Press. Now, these are extremely cold-hardy animals. They're dying for the same reasons the cattle die, and just like what happened in Dakota, after this event passes, after the cold, dense layer of chemically nucleated air dissipates, the temperatures go right back up. But the headline was created, and that was the goal of the climate engineers, one of their primary goals. Climate intervention continues in plain sight and is wreaking havoc with the climate system, shredding the ozone layer, which is exposing us all to extremely dangerous levels of UV radiation. And there's, of course, the fact that our breathable air column, as I mentioned earlier, is completely laden with highly toxic metals and chemicals that are part of the climate engineering operations. So when we see all these neurological disorders happening, it's not just vaccinations. That's a huge issue. But climate engineering, we can't hide from. It's in the air, and we have to breathe. It's that simple. Heavy metals and chemicals that each and every one of us are inhaling with every breath are coming from the climate engineering operations. And about agency officials, as I've stated so many times on the record and even during this show, their assignment from the power structure they serve is to pacify the population, to hide the threats and dangers, not to expose them or actually mitigate them. On that point, here's a recent headline. Florida regulators sign off on controversial water standards. From this report, despite vehement opposition from environmental groups and citizens, state regulators signed off Tuesday, this last Tuesday, on new standards for Florida's rivers, lakes, and coastal waters that include less stringent requirements for toxic chemicals. The state's Environmental Regulation Commission approved the new human health criteria for surface waters. The decision came after hours of emotional testimony from concerned citizens, not that their testimony mattered, obviously, who said the new standards will increase the risk of Floridians getting cancer from eating seafood and drinking water. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection, again, an agency whose job it is to hide the threat from the public, obviously, under the Federal Clean Water Act, is required to periodically update limits on a number of toxic chemicals it will allow to be dumped into its surface waters. Why would they allow any chemicals to be dumped into the surface waters at all? This is, again, the same type of insanity I'm talking about, pumping fracking fluid into wells, poisoning aquifers, dumping it in the ocean. This is a human mentality. And for those who think this is not harming the environment, you're not living in reality. Continuing from this report, it tried to update standards, this is the Florida EPA, on the books in '92, but didn't win ERC approval. The agency, as part of its latest plan, updated limits for 43 of 54 allowed chemicals and added 38 more compounds to the list, nearly doubling the number of toxic compounds it regulates. About half of the chemicals regulated today, however, would have less stringent standards, and limits for most of the 80-plus chemicals would have less standards than the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recommendations. Now, again, it's not like there's a safe limit. There's no safe amount of any of these chemicals. But anytime the limits go up, just like after Fukushima, when the radiation was pouring into the U.S. West Coast, what did some agencies do? They upped the, quote, safe limit of radiation by about 10,000%. So suddenly, the public is told, we're within safe limits of radiation. There is no safe level of radiation. And when they up the safe limit 10,000%, how incredibly insane is that? And the same thing's happening here. Just hide it by upping the, quote, safe standards and telling the population it's all fine. Go back to eating your toxic fish and drinking your toxic water. That's what's going on here. It's exactly what's going on. Continuing from the report, under the plan, limits of benzene, a carcinogen used in fracking that is known to cause leukemia, would nearly double. Less stringent limits are also in place now for arsenic and well-known poisonous substances and PCBs, banned substances linked to numerous health problems. So we have these quote-unquote public protection agencies, like this headline just stated in Florida, simply voting through, as special interests tell them to, vote it through so the public can be told that we're within safe limits that have just been raised. And the public is all too happy to be told what they want to hear. Nothing to worry about. Go back to using your house as an ATM because the interest rates are artificially low because the central bankers want to artificially keep the card house economy going as long as possible. So continue to use your house for an ATM, buy new vehicles with nothing down, no interest and no payments for who knows how long, and pretend everything's okay while you're eating toxic food and drinking toxic water and breathing toxic air. That paradigm won't continue much longer. And through all of this, the corporate media parade of election mass distraction continues. It's constant. I always try to view all sources of media throughout the week, the political conventions included. I force myself to do this. It's not that I want to do this. I keep media going in the background while I'm working on my workstation with 10, 12 hours a day of communications and efforts on the climate engineering battle and vaccinations now with the event. But I always have media going in the background from different sources. So I suffered through both political conventions, and the Republican and Democrat conventions are both travesties, certainly. But I was especially appalled at the Democratic fiasco that looked like some sort of bizarre religious revival with Carole King singing "You've Got a Friend" to a bunch of chanting and rocking people in the crowd. It's incredibly ridiculous. And what does all this idiocy look like to those in other countries? What do other populations feel while watching such theater, while their countries are being occupied and bombed with U.S. drone attacks? There's U.S. boots on the ground in 156 countries around the globe. What would Americans do if a few of those countries had bases in our homeland? What would they do? How would they feel? How would they feel, as I've stated so many times, if those countries were setting up missile batteries on our borders? The hypocrisy needs to go. So, again, with the political conventions, they're absurd, but the Democratic convention, most absurd of all. I was completely shocked at even watching. It was hard to watch, frankly. And on a final note, with the Democratic convention, although I'm no fan of Trump, I can't even begin to imagine a Clinton presidency. Clinton is the epitome of what's wrong in the world. And I can't imagine that such a candidate could even be reasonably considered. Now, how is it that so many members of society become willing participants in the ongoing cancer that's consuming the planet and facilitating the ever-increased poisoning of the population? And let's examine this issue in more detail with a well-researched report titled International Crimes and Criminology. This report is titled Perpetrators of International Crimes, because so many people wonder, how can my fellow citizens behave in this way? How can they do what they do? Let's go through this report. The gassings in Auschwitz, the abuse at Abu Ghraib, the mass rapes in the DRC, the murders in South Africa, the mass graves in Srebrenica, the terrible poison attacks in Iraq, and more recently in Syria. Why do people commit such atrocities? Who are these people, and how can anyone be so cruel? First excerpt from this report. How ordinary people can transform into perpetrators. International crimes are so atrocious that we instinctively distance ourselves from the perpetrators and prefer to see them as cruel and sadistic psychopaths. Very different from us. Ordinary people. A very small minority of the perpetrators are indeed sadists and psychopaths, but most perpetrators are ordinary and law-abiding citizens who commit their crimes in order and orders of the state. In extreme circumstances such as war, ordinary people can be transformed into perpetrators of extreme atrocities. Within this transformation process, a number of phases can be distinguished. The preparation phase, the initiation phase, the habituation phase, and the routinization phase, and the reflection phase. It turns out that all perpetrators are shocked, disgusted, and horrified after they have tortured, raped, or killed for the first time. The way they respond to their own horror and disgust is decisive and crucial in the transformation process. Do they decide to never obey such an order again, despite the danger the decision might put them in? Or, much more likely, do they start to rationalize and justify their own behavior? If they choose to do the latter, then they will do anything to soothe their own conscience. They will convince themselves that they did not do anything wrong and made the right choice to obey the order. They will convince themselves that the victims deserved their fate, and that if they would not have obeyed the orders, that someone else would have done so. Now, what kind of insane justification is that? And I saw an interview with the pilot of the Enola Gay who dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, justifying his action. Those people were innocent, and those bombs didn't need to be dropped. But what kind of burden must he have carried, that he was responsible for killing 100,000 innocent people? That's the kind of process we're talking about here. Continuing from this report, once perpetrators start to rationalize and justify their behavior, they will not find any means to resist the subsequent order to torture, maim, or kill, and will feel completely compelled to obey the next order, to maim, torture, or kill. The more they do so, the more they will feel the need to rationalize and justify their obedience, but along the way they become better and better at it. After a while, they will start to get used to the violence and will be able to maim, torture, and kill without any further pangs of conscience. Continuing from this report, typology of perpetrators, type of individuals. Not all perpetrators are the same. Some perpetrators are powerful political leaders, such as heads of state, leaders of rebel forces. These perpetrators initiate the crimes. Others organize the violence and execute the repression. Violent or even genocidal policies developed by the political leaders. They are the bureaucrats. Still others physically execute the policies and maim, kill, or rape other people with their own hands. These are the low-ranking foot soldiers, the hands-on soldiers who have no power and just execute the orders given to them. Perpetrators differ in their motives, too. Some are driven by ideology, as for instance the radical extremist who is driven forward by his own hatred, or the devoted warrior who is a loyal soldier convinced that he has to obey whatever order he is given. That's what's happening in our society. That's what our military is about. Don't question. That's what our medical industrial complex is about. Don't question. Just do what you're told. Do what the quote experts tell you, and don't question. If we're given a sense of reason, it's our obligation, it's our responsibility to use that sense of reason and not to put it on a shelf and behave as this report describes. Continuing from this report, others are driven by self-interest. An example, therefore, would be the common criminals who take advantage of the war to further their criminal activities. Periods of political violence are often a form of social engineering. providing new opportunities for people in the lower echelons of society to make themselves a career. These perpetrators take advantage of the suffering of the victims. Others are just followers, people who do not lead nor take their own decisions, but just follow the flow. Some perpetrators are forced to cooperate or are vulnerable. In total, we can distinguish 9 different types of perpetrators: the criminal mastermind, the careerist, the profiteer, the fanatic, the devoted warrior, the professional, the criminal and sadist, the follower, and the compromised perpetrator. Periods of mass violence occurred during periods of political upheaval, when a repressive or genocidal policy is developed and the group dynamics between various types of perpetrators lead them to collectively commit atrocities. Let me sum this all up. We have a scenario here that's happening all over the globe. It's happening in the U.S. right now. How many people in our own military, for example, are participating in activities that they know are wrong in other countries? And they are waking up, and I'm hearing from a lot of them. I am hearing from people just getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan. They know what's wrong. What happened to Pat Tillman? Pat Tillman was an exceptional human being. Look him up. Find out who he is if you don't already know. Exceptionally intelligent human being who enlisted as an Army Ranger in spite of having multi-million-dollar football contracts, enlisted as an Army Ranger because he wanted to do what was right, and when he learned how wrong everything was, and he began to record that, and he began to state he was going to speak out about that. What happened to Pat Tillman? He was killed by our own military. His death was then lied about for as long as they could get away with the lie, but Pat's parents, extremely intelligent people, also helped to uncover that lie. And we now know that Pat Tillman, because he was going to blow the whistle on just how incredibly corrupt our military was behaving in other countries, he was taken out, involved in a friendly fire ambush, took 3 rounds to the head at close range from another U.S. soldier. All his belongings were burnt, his journals were burnt, and a story was fabricated about how he died, and they maintained that story as long as they could until it became uncovered. That's what happens to truth tellers in our military. So I'm asking our military brothers and sisters, many who signed up with honorable intentions, like Pat Tillman, wake up, join together, and refuse to cooperate with what you're being used for, because you're not helping the American population with the policies you're engaged in. You're not helping our chances for survival on a planet that's being systematically snuffed out. And who's the largest single consumer of petrocarbon on the planet Earth? Who's flying the aircraft that are engaged in the climate intervention programs? Who's orchestrating all this? The U.S. military. Other countries are doing it as well. But if our military stop, they have the power to make sure other countries stop, if they would choose to exercise that power, period. I want to finish from this report. Perpetrators always commit their crimes in a very particular political, ideological, and institutional context, which results in an enormous social pressure to accept this context and to define as legitimate what the leaders of a country or the majority of the group defines as legitimate. The herd mentality, groupthink. Don't question. This is the paradigm that must be broken if we're to have any chance of survival. Continuing from this report, during the Second World War, many people no longer perceived the extermination process as anything out of the ordinary. This was true for the camp guards who worked at Auschwitz, but also for those who worked within the bureaucracy, like Eckelmann. During the genocide in Rwanda, many of the victims, between 800,000 and 1 million people, in 3 months were killed by killer groups of 10 to 100 people. These killers believed, or were made to believe, that the killings were necessary. They were killed with machetes, by the way. Think about that. Almost 1 million people killed with machetes. We didn't hear about that here, did we? How many people even know about this? The perpetrators interviewed in Rwanda all stated that it might be hard to understand in retrospect, but that at the time, the killings seemed like completely justified and legitimate to them. The pictures of the abuse of Iraqi prisoners by American soldiers at Abu Ghraib prison, which were broadcast on American television in the program of 60 Minutes, shocked the world. But here, too, many of the perpetrators believed they were doing the right thing, protecting their country from yet another terrorist attack, such as 9/11, which we know was a false flag event. Our own elements in our own government were behind that. Look at how all these dots connect. Clamping down on society, using false flag events to justify this behavior, and so many unquestioning order followers carrying out the dirty work. And that's what I'm asking our military brothers and sisters to stop doing. Stop participating in crimes that are not about freedom and democracy, but about power and control for the global elite. I'm asking you to investigate, that's all. I'm not against our military brothers and sisters. In fact, we have no chance of changing direction without them waking up. We have no chance. We must have our military brothers and sisters on our side, and many are waking up. As I've stated in previous shows, I've communicated with military Army Major General, Air Force General, and others with lower rank that are absolutely waking up and telling me others are in the ranks as well. Now, on a final note here from this report, female perpetrators, and this leads up to Hillary Clinton, so bear with me. Final statement in this report, only a very small percentage, 1% of the perpetrators convicted by international criminal courts and tribunals are women. This raises the question as to whether women are less evil than men. With literature, it is generally assumed that the genocide in Rwanda was unprecedented in relation to the role played by women, and that it is the first and only period of mass violence in which many women were involved. This, however, is not true. Women have played a much larger role than we have generally assumed so far in, for instance, the Nazi Holocaust, but also in many other periods of collective violence. The evidence furthermore shows that women can be just as evil as men and involved in genocide, terrorist attacks, torture, sexual violence, as aiders and abettors, but also as the principal perpetrators and instigators. Although it indeed seems true that generally far less women than men are involved in mass atrocities, the reason why there are fewer female than male perpetrators is because women are underrepresented within the military units and amongst political leadership, and thus are less often in a position to commit such crimes. When women do get involved in mass atrocities, they are often portrayed as sadists, mentally disturbed, or otherwise very unnatural women. It might, however, be questioned whether these women are any less ordinary than their male counterparts. What's the summation of this? That the notion that women will not participate in the sort of insanity we see happening around the globe is a very, very false notion. And let's take a case in point. Hillary Clinton. Knowing what we know about Hillary Clinton, is there any doubt in anyone's mind that she fits this profile? How many crimes do we need to see from the Clintons? And how can you possibly have, again, this is so ridiculous, that we could have a father and a son in the White House, and we could have a husband and a wife in the White House. How utterly ridiculous is this? How can something like this even be entertained, and let alone Hillary Clinton, who is clearly a criminal like her husband? And again, I'm not a Trump fan at all. How can we have such poor choices overall? But the thought of Hillary Clinton in the White House is absolutely alarming to me beyond what I can state. Who knows what may happen in the next few months to disrupt the entire global paradigm, but it's truly astounding that, again, a candidate like Hillary Clinton could even be considered. And not that Trump is that far behind in many measures from a global perspective. Where do we go from here? The ongoing assault against our children with unsafe vaccinations, the population as a whole with toxic foods and water, and the total onslaught against the entire planet with climate engineering and weather warfare. Can we expose and halt this insanity that's closing in on us from every direction? That depends on what we do or what we don't do. And no matter how dark the horizon is, it will not get better unless or until we all stand together and make our voices heard for the common good. This means action, not apathy, not idle angst, not denial, not rationalization. I hope all that are able will make the time to join the major public awareness event and call to action event. That's the Cascade Theater on Friday, August 5th. Pick up event flyers from Orchard Nutrition, help circulate them, assist in the all-important effort to wake up the masses. To what countless government agencies and medical corporations and mainstream media is doing their best to hide. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We must all commit ourselves to the battle for the greater good if we're to have any future whatsoever to salvage for our children. Stay vigilant, keep an eye on the horizon, show up at the Reading event. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.
is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to This Live.